This is Combat Commander video number 2. So a quick word about the flow of the game. It's an I go, you go type of game. I have a turn, you have a turn. In my turn I have two choices. I can play a certain number of orders from my hand up to my order limit, which is defined in the scenario that you're playing. It's one of the ways that the game models the efficiency of the force that you're playing as. The ability to play more than one order in from your hand per turn. The other choice I have is to forego the playing of any orders, and I can discard cards from my hand if I feel that I've got some cards in my hand that are not very useful. I can discard them and draw some new ones up to my hand size. The number of cards that you're allowed to discard is based upon the army that you're playing, and again is another way that the game models the efficiency of the various forces. So the nations like Germany would be able to discard nearly their entire hand, I think, whereas somebody like the Italians, I think they can only discard one card, so it'd be very difficult. If they had a handful of rubbish, it's going to take them a while to discard the useless cards, and they're not going to be playing any orders in that time. So it's a simple case of then my turn's over, and then it's your turn, and you play some orders, or you choose to discard, and then it's back to me, and so on. The time track that we looked at before, I said it wasn't quite as simple as, we both had a turn, we move the time on one, like a lot of games are. I have a go, you have a go, right? We move the time on one space, then we keep going, and we have a certain number of, a fixed number of turns. In this game, it's very variable. There are two ways in which the time marker is moved on. Now, in some of these cards, we said before that we don't have dice in Combat Commander. We reveal cards, and we have the dice roll result that's on the cards. For example, this one is a 5 and a 1. Sometimes when you're revealing cards for the dice roll, you'll see that the dice roll has a red box around it with a word on it. These are called triggers, and what would generally happen is that you would pause whatever action, whatever thing you were doing in the game that caused you to roll the dice. You would just pause what you were doing, you resolve the trigger, and then you'll go back to whatever you were doing. So there are 4 different triggers in the game. Very briefly, I'll probably come back to these in more detail, but you've got an event trigger, which is you would draw the next card from the top of your deck, and you would read the event off, and then you would resolve it. Fairly straightforward. You've got a jam trigger, which is to do with weapons, and I think if it's in a fire attack, if you roll a jam trigger, then it's going to break the weapons that you're using. I'll come back to that. We'll do all the triggers in much more detail later. You've got sniper again, which is you would draw another card, you would read off the random hex. This is one of the ways that we use the random hexes, and then you would have the choice to break a unit in that hex or in any adjacent hex. So it's very sniper, very random, as you would expect. And the one that we're concentrating on this time is a time trigger. So if a time trigger is revealed when you're rolling the dice, when you're revealing the card to roll the dice, then that is when the time marker would be moved on one space on the track. You would also take your discard pile and shuffle it into your draw pile to get a fresh draw deck. That's one way that time is moved on, and that's the kind of random way, because I think there are a couple of time triggers in your deck usually, so it could come out at any time. You're not quite sure. That's one way that time markers moved on. The other way that the time markers moved on is if you get to the bottom of your draw deck, you've got nothing left in your draw deck, you've only got stuff in your discard pile, you've drawn your final card, then you would it would be as if a time trigger had been revealed. You would shuffle the cards, discard pile to make a new draw deck. You would move time on. There's a couple of other things that you do that we'll perhaps talk about later. Things like smoke, and sometimes the defenders get a victory point, things like that. There's a little procedure, a little flow chart in the rules that you follow every time a time trigger is revealed. So that's how time is moved on. So it's very random. It can happen at any time. You're not sure. Pardon the pun. But you would have on the time track, you would have a sudden death marker. So you don't always start at 0, and I'll explain the reason for that in a minute, but you would have a starting point in your scenario for the time track, and you would have a sudden death marker. Once you get to the sudden death marker, it doesn't necessarily mean the game's over. Every time you reveal a time trigger from then on, including the time that you've got to the sudden death marker, you would then make a dice roll. You would reveal a card, and if the result is less than where the time marker currently is, then the game would end. If it was equal to or more than, then the game would continue. So this is one of the reasons it doesn't always start at 0 and end at a certain number. If the game was to start at 0, say, and end at 7, like the time track, in this scenario, once it gets to 7, chances are you may roll an 8 or more, and the game would continue. So you can't kind of bank on the fact that it's going to end when the time track gets to 7. But say if you started at 4 and you ended at 11, would still be 7 spaces on the time track, but once it gets to 11, the chances are the game's going to end, because you'd have to roll a double 6 for it to continue, or 11 or a 12 for it to continue, which is fairly unlikely. So it's one of the ways that the game kind of, if it's going to end fairly certainly if the sudden death mark is high, but if it's quite low, there's always the chance that it's going to continue. So after that ramble about the how time works in Combat Commander, let's talk a little bit more about orders then. So what does that actually mean? Well, we've got two things on our cards. We've got orders and we've got actions. The orders, it's just a word. You have to learn what the orders do. And they're the things that you play, from your hand during your turn. You can only play the orders during your turn. And the other bit is the action. Now the text for the action is included on the card, so you don't need to, there are quite a number of actions, you don't need to learn off the top of your head what all the actions do perhaps, and I'll probably go through what some of the more tricky actions do during the tutorials, but I probably won't go through everything. I will go through all of the orders, because it's important that you know how to do those. But the actions can be played at any time during your turn or your opponent's turn, just when you meet the prerequisites for the action. So this one says concealment, play before making a defense roll, reduce the fire attack total by the covering the target's head. So whenever you're making a defense roll, you could play this from your hand. Doesn't matter if it's your turn, if it's your opponent's turn, you can play that action whenever you're making a defense roll. This one says, this action says add +2 when firing a mortar or a machine gun. If the fire attack is rolled, it doubles break it. So you can play that whenever you're firing a mortar or a machine gun. It's as simple as that. The action's fairly self-explanatory for the most part. You will notice that we've got orders here, order move, and this one order recover, but these cards for the orders, they say command confusion, and what these are essentially dud cards in your hand. The ratio of the orders is dependent on the nation that you're playing. It's again another way that the game models the style of your army. So perhaps somebody like the Russians would have a lot of advance orders, so they're good in close combat. They might not have quite so many fire orders. The Germans might have a lot of fire orders. They might have a lot of move orders. It depends. They might have a small number of command confusion cards. I don't know the ratios off the top of my head, but it's just one of the ways that it shows the different styles of the armies. Again, you can have this one has a combat command confusion for the order and the action. At least this card here, you could use it for the action if you wanted to, but this one's a total dud. There's no action, there's no order on it, so it would be a complete. You need to get that card out of your hand as soon as possible, really. When we are using an order, I'll begin to go through the different orders in the next video, but generally speaking, when you play an order, depending on the order, you usually activate something. With quite a few of the orders, you activate a unit. With a couple of the orders, you activate a player, your opponent or yourself. Each element in the game can only be activated once per turn. So you couldn't say play a move order on a rifle squad, move them into a nice place, and then play a fire squad all in the same of your own turns. You couldn't, if you had like an order limit of 3, you couldn't play move and then move them again perhaps and then fire. They can only be activated once in each turn. It also works for the players. For instance, a rout order you would play on your opponent perhaps, and you would try and rout all of their broken troops. You couldn't try and rout twice in the same turn. So activation, you can only activate anything once per turn.